In 1970, Ford built an engine that was never supposed to exist. It wasn't in the official product plans. It wasn't on the neat corporate roadmaps. And yet, when it roared to life, it threatened to destroy Ford's own hierarchy from the inside. This wasn't just horsepower. This wasn't just speed. This was rebellion, cast in iron. They called it the 351 Cleveland.
And if you ask old-school racers, they'll tell you this wasn't just another V8.
It was the engine Ford tried to erase from history. But why would a company sabotage its own creation? Why would Ford lie about one of the most advanced small blocks it ever built? And how did this accident of engineering become a ghost that still haunts drag strips, NASCAR legends, and Australian highways to this very day? This is the story Ford never wanted you to hear. The story of betrayal, buried blueprints, and an engine too good for its own time. So buckle up, because once you understand what really happened to the 351 Cleveland, you'll start asking yourself, what else have automakers lied about? The late 1960s. America was living in the golden era of horsepower. Ford was riding high on the Mustang craze. The Boss 302 was making headlines in Trans Am. The 428 Cobra Jet was terrifying drag strips. But beneath all that glory, a quiet crisis was brewing inside Ford's engineering departments. The small block Windsor Vive 8, designed back in 1961, had reached the end of its evolutionary path. It was light, affordable, reliable, but airflow was choking it. By the time it was stretched to 351 cubic inches, engineers knew the truth. This engine family couldn't keep up with the growing muscle car wars. So what do you do when your corporate bosses won't approve a brand new engine family? You rebel. In back rooms, Ford engineers began experimenting, borrowing casting techniques from Australia, applying lessons learned from the radical Boss engines. They designed a new block so different from the Windsor that it barely shared anything with it. The result, an overbuilt, high-revving small block with huge ports, canted valves, and breathing capacity that rivaled big blocks. It was tough, it was fast, it was dangerous, and it wasn't supposed to exist. On paper, the Cleveland looked like a natural evolution of the Windsor, but in reality, it was a rebellion cast in iron. It didn't follow the rules. It didn't follow the hierarchy. And worst of all, it was too good. When the first 351 Clevelands hit the streets, they didn't just perform. They embarrassed bigger, more expensive Ford engines. Torinos with factory Cleveland blocks were outrunning 429 Cobras. Mustangs with Cleveland small blocks were making dyno numbers higher than the brochures dared admit. The suits in Dearborn noticed, and they weren't happy. See, Ford wasn't just selling horsepower, it was selling structure. Big blocks were supposed to dominate. Small blocks were supposed to be nimble, affordable, but not dominant. The Cleveland shattered that illusion. And in doing so, it made enemies not just on the street, but inside Ford headquarters. By 1971, the Cleveland had gone from experiment to street legend. But that success was a political nightmare. Why? Because suddenly, Ford's entire marketing hierarchy was upside down. How do you convince customers to pay extra for a big block when your small block is outrunning it at half the cost? Internal memos started circulating. High-performance Cleveland options quietly disappeared from order sheets. Closed chamber heads and solid lifter cams, gone. Dealerships were instructed to steer buyers towards safer choices like the 429 and 460. And in the media, silence. Despite its performance, Ford didn't heavily advertise the Cleveland. It was as if they wanted to bury their own creation before the public realized what it really was. Even in NASCAR, where the Cleveland's canted valve heads were proving devastating, Ford began restricting official support. Competitors complained. Chevy was watching. Mopar was furious. And Ford's boardroom began asking an uncomfortable question. Have we created something we can't control? Then came 1972. Emissions laws were tightening. Insurance companies were cracking down on high horsepower cars. For Ford, this was the perfect excuse. The first move? Replace the closed chamber heads with open designs, killing compression and neutering power. The second move? Discontinue the highest output Cleveland variants altogether. And finally, the ultimate sleight of hand, Ford began quietly replacing the Cleveland with the Windsor-based 351 Modified. a heavier, less efficient, slower engine that shared the name, but none of the spirit. On paper, the Cleveland was still available, but in reality, it was being erased. And if you were a Ford engineer who had poured your heart into this masterpiece, you knew the truth. The Cleveland wasn't killed by emissions. It was killed by politics. But what Ford didn't know was that you can't kill a legend that fast. But what Ford didn't know was that you can't kill a legend that fast. By the mid-1970s, the Cleveland wasn't just an engine. It was a political hot potato. Inside Ford, a new culture had taken over. The oil crisis was looming. Insurance companies were punishing high-horsepower cars, emissions rules were tightening, and Ford executives were desperate to appear compliant, efficient, and predictable. But the Cleveland refused to play by those rules. It was too powerful, too rebellious, too good. Internal memos from the executive floor paint a chilling picture. Engineers wanted to refine the Cleveland for emissions. They wanted to adapt it. But top management pushed back. Focus on the Windsor, they wrote. Standardize. Conform. Think about that for a moment. Ford had in its hands an engine architecture capable of running cooler, revving higher, breathing cleaner, and they chose to bury it. Why? Because it wasn't part of the 5-year plan. Because it threatened the big block hierarchy. Because it embarrassed engines they'd spent millions advertising. So they pulled strings quietly. Brochures were edited mid-print. High-performance options suddenly became unavailable. Dealerships were instructed to push Windsor-based 351S, even though every mechanic knew the Cleveland was the superior machine. This wasn't just engineering, this was politics, and the Cleveland was the scapegoat. But while Detroit turned its back, halfway across the world in Australia, a very different story was unfolding. Ford Australia saw in the Cleveland what Dearborn refused to admit: raw potential. When they slotted the engine into the Falcon GT, it wasn't just an experiment. It was a revelation. The Bathurst 1000, Australia's grueling endurance race, became the Cleveland's proving ground. Picture it: Mount Panorama, 1972. Rolling hills, endless straights, punishing corners. Here, engines weren't measured by marketing hype. They were measured by survival. And the Cleveland not only survived, it dominated. Australian engineers refined the design, tuning it for endurance and reliability. The Phase 3 Falcon GT became a legend, often called the greatest muscle car Australia ever produced. With its Cleveland heart, it humbled competitors and earned cult status. And then came the what-if moment, the Phase 4 Falcon GT. Built with Cleveland power, it was so fast, so dangerous, that politicians literally banned it from production, fearing it would unleash uncontrollable speed on public roads. Imagine that. An engine so good it scared not just competitors, but governments. While Ford America quietly erased the Cleveland, Ford Australia immortalized it. They embraced its outlawed DNA. And in doing so, they preserved a piece of muscle car history that Detroit tried to kill. Back in the US, the Cleveland wasn't supposed to exist anymore. But legends don't need factories. They need believers. In garages across small-town America, something strange was happening. Engine builders were whispering, experimenting, swapping parts. Cleveland heads found their way onto Windsor blocks, creating hybrid beasts that no catalog ever listed. These clevers combined Windsor's accessibility with Cleveland's breathing power, the ultimate act of rebellion. Street racers bragged about them. Dyno sheets circulated like contraband, showing numbers Ford's brochures never dared print. Imagine being a young gearhead in 1978, standing in a cold garage, staring at a block your father said was obsolete, and then firing it up to find it pulled harder than any big block in town. That feeling, that's where legends are born. And it wasn't just the streets. In NASCAR, renegade builders like Jack Roush refused to let the Cleveland die. They pushed its architecture into new forms, sneaking Cleveland DNA into engines that kept winning long after Ford corporate abandoned it. Ford may have thought they could erase the Cleveland. But every drag strip pass, every whispered rumor of a backyard build, every outlaw NASCAR engine proved the opposite. The Cleveland wasn't dead. It was underground. And underground is where legends grow teeth. Here's the most haunting part of the Cleveland story. Not what it was, but what it could have been. In hidden labs and test cells, engineers were working on prototypes that could have changed Ford's future. Imagine a 351 Cleveland with electronic fuel injection, dyno-tested, emissions-compliant, delivering over 300 horsepower with 30% better fuel economy. This wasn't fantasy. It existed. They called it Clev EFI. It worked. And then, overnight, it was canceled. Why? Not because it failed, not because it couldn't meet regulations, but because the executives said no, because it didn't fit the corporate vision. Think about the alternate history. What if Ford had embraced the Cleveland's efficiency in the 1970s? What if Mustangs of the fuel crisis era had come armed with high-revving, efficient small blocks instead of choked, underpowered Windsor variants? What if Ford had led the emissions era instead of limping behind GM and Chrysler? The Cleveland had the DNA to do it. It was ahead of its time, high-flow heads, canted valves, architecture that screamed for modernization. But instead of building the future, Ford buried it. And that's the real tragedy. The Cleveland wasn't just erased. The future it represented was erased with it. Today, nearly 50 years later, the Cleveland is more than an engine. It's a ghost, a survivor, a rebel that refuses to be silenced. Collectors scour junkyards for Cleveland blocks like treasure hunters. Builders swap Cleveland heads onto Windsor foundations to create hybrids Ford never dared imagine. In Australia, Falcon GTs still roar across racetracks, reminding the world that Detroit's cast-offs became global legends. But beyond the metal, beyond the horsepower, there's something bigger: meaning. The Cleveland story is proof that corporations don't always know best. That sometimes the greatest innovations come from rebellion, from engineers pushing against the rules, from machines that scare the boardroom. Ask yourself, why do we still talk about it today? Why does the Cleveland, a short-lived engine from the early 70s, still stir passion, still inspire builders, still spark debates on forums and racetracks? Because it wasn't just horsepower. It was defiance. It was possibility. It was proof that greatness doesn't need permission. And if you were lucky enough to stand at a drag strip in 1971 and hear a Cleveland scream past 7,000 revolutions per minute, and if you were lucky enough to stand at a drag strip in 1971 and hear a Cleveland scream past 7,000 revolutions per minute, you'd never forget that sound. That immortal roar of rebellion cast in iron. The 351 Cleveland. The engine Ford tried to erase, but couldn't kill.
By the late 70s, NASCAR wasn't just a racing series. It was the heart of American motorsport culture. A place where manufacturers fought for dominance, not with ads, but with lap times. And buried deep inside some of the fastest cars on the oval was a ghost: the Cleveland. Jack Roush, Robert Yates, and a handful of rogue engine builders knew something Ford's boardroom didn't want to admit. The Cleveland heads, with their canted valve design and massive ports, were unbeatable for airflow. They took Windsor blocks, disguised them as compliant Cup engines, and crowned them with Cleveland heads. Suddenly, engines that looked like Windsors on paper were pulling power that left competitors stunned. Fans in the stands had no idea. To them, those stock cars were just decals and thunder. But in the pits, whispers spread. That's not a Windsor under the hood, that's Cleveland blood. And here's the twist: NASCAR never officially acknowledged it. Rulebooks were bent, papers were shuffled, but the wins kept coming. The Cleveland lived on, not through official channels but through the stubborn brilliance of engine builders who refused to let Detroit politics erase good engineering. While NASCAR was bending rules, drag strips across America were breaking them wide open. Picture a Saturday night in 1982. A two-lane strip outside a small Midwestern town. The air smells like rubber and gasoline. A Camaro idles in one lane, its driver smirking. Next to it, a Mustang with an engine the crowd swears is just a Windsor. But when the lights drop, the Mustang explodes off the line, pulling past with a scream that doesn't sound Windsor at all. Under the hood, a Cleveland hybrid. Street racers loved the Cleveland because it was unpredictable. Junkyard parts, mix and match builds, secret swaps, every car was a mystery. One guy runs iron 4V heads with custom headers, another mixes two V heads for torque and sprays nitrous, another bolts Cleveland heads onto a 400 block, creating torque monsters that could smoke tires 3 gears deep. In garages across America, these weren't builds for profit, they were builds for pride, for proving the brochures wrong, for humiliating the neighbor's Chevy, for showing that the Cleveland wasn't just alive, it was untouchable. And that outlaw spirit is why the Cleveland became more than an engine. It became a banner, a quiet rebellion that still echoes in drag strips today. The most brutal part of the Cleveland story isn't just its erasure, it's who erased it. While Ford executives buried the Cleveland, their rivals at GM and Chrysler were embracing innovation. Chevy pushed its small block forward, constantly evolving it. Chrysler refined the Hemi, turning it into a marketing legend. Meanwhile, Ford told its engineers to stand down. Think about the betrayal. Ford had the most advanced small block architecture in Detroit. High-flow heads, endurance-tested bottom ends, potential to evolve into EFI monsters that could have crushed GM in the 1980s horsepower wars, and yet they killed it. Not because it wasn't good enough, but because it was too good. This is why enthusiasts still burn about it today. It wasn't failure, it wasn't obsolescence, it was corporate betrayal. The Windsor lived not because it was better, but because it was easier, because it fit the marketing plan, because Ford executives were too afraid of their own greatness. And while GM turned the Chevy small block into the most successful engine family in history, Ford let its crown jewel rust. That's not just a mistake, that's a tragedy. But legends don't stay buried. And by the 1990s, the Cleveland was making a comeback. Hot rodders rediscovered the architecture. Aftermarket companies started producing Cleveland heads again. Aluminum this time, lighter, stronger, even more efficient. Builders realized they could bolt Cleveland heads onto Windsor-based stroker kits, creating 393S, 408S, even 427 cubic inch monsters. The results? Staggering. Engines that pulled to 7,500 revolutions per minute with street reliability. Builds that made 600 horsepower naturally aspirated. Stroker kits that turned junkyard blocks into dyno queens. And suddenly, young builders who weren't even alive in the 70s were obsessed with the Cleveland. Forums lit up with debates, 2V versus 4V heads, best combo for street torque, clever versus pure Cleveland. The same questions whispered in garages in 1978 were now shouted online in 2002. The resurrection wasn't about nostalgia, it was about performance, about unfinished business, about proving that the engine Ford tried to erase was in fact, timeless. Here's the twist most Americans don't know. While Ford USA abandoned the Cleveland, the world didn't. In Brazil, Ford produced the 302C and 351C variants well into the 1980s. They powered Galaxies, Landau luxury sedans, even trucks. In South America, the Cleveland wasn't a ghost, it was mainstream. In Europe, racers imported Australian Falcons with Cleveland power. On tracks in Germany and the UK, American small blocks shocked competitors used to high-revving European engines. Suddenly, the Cleveland wasn't just Detroit's outlaw, it was a global ambassador of brute force. And today, the cult spans continents. In Australia, Phase 3 Falcons are million-dollar collectibles. In the US, Clavers dominate dyno competitions. In Brazil, old Fords still roll with Cleveland DNA. The world adopted what Detroit rejected, and in doing so it proved a truth that corporate America still hates to admit. The Cleveland wasn't a mistake, it was a masterpiece. History has a cruel way of hiding its most powerful secrets, and with the Cleveland, those secrets lie in destroyed prototypes, shredded documents, and whispered memories from retired engineers. In the early 70s, Ford's Skunk Works division tested things the public never knew: experimental fuel injection Clevelands, aluminum head designs that shaved 75 pounds off the block, smog-legal prototypes that passed emissions yet still out-revved Windsor competition. Some insiders even claim a turbocharged Cleveland Mule existed, a setup designed to take on Porsche's rising turbo cars. But why don't we see these engines in museums today? Because they were erased. Corporate policy demanded all test mules destroyed. Engines were broken apart, notes were burned, and engineers were told never to speak. Imagine the heartbreak. To design something that could change the industry, and then be ordered to dismantle it yourself. For many Ford engineers, the Cleveland wasn't just an engine, it was a dream crushed by politics. And those prototypes? They haunt us with the biggest what-if in Ford history. The 2000s brought something Ford never predicted: the resto-mod movement. Builders were no longer satisfied with restoring cars as they were. They wanted to reimagine them, and at the heart of countless resto-mods roared the Cleveland. Picture this: a 1970 Mustang Fastback, painted deep metallic black. From the outside it looks vintage: chrome bumpers, Magnum 500 wheels, classic lines. But pop the hood, And there it is. A 408-stroker Cleveland, aluminum heads, electronic fuel injection, coil-on-plug ignition, old soul, modern heartbeat. Why the Cleveland? Because its architecture lent itself to reinvention. Its heads were decades ahead of their time. Its block could handle abuse. Builders realized they could blend 1970 with 2020 and create something Ford itself never dared to release. Today, resto-mods sell for six figures at auction. Not because they're original, but because they're alive. And time after time, it's the Cleveland builds that steal the spotlight. Proof that you can bury a name in the corporate archives, but you can't kill the roar of innovation. In the old days, Cleveland myths spread in garages, whispered over carburetors and greasy manuals. But in the 2010s, the myths found a new home: the internet. YouTube channels began uncovering Cleveland builds. Forums like Ford Muscle and Cleveland.net became archives of secret knowledge. Builders in Australia uploaded Falcon GT rev tests, their exhaust notes screaming through laptop speakers in American bedrooms. Suddenly, a new generation discovered an engine their fathers thought was extinct. And here's the wild part: some of these videos went viral. Teens who never touched a carburetor watched Cleveland dyno pulls with millions of views. A story Ford buried in 1974 was resurrected by Pixels and Wi-Fi in 2018. What does that say about legend, about legacy? It says you cannot kill truth. Not with memos, not with marketing, not even with time. The Cleveland lives now not just in steel and oil, but in memory, in code, in pixels. Every video, every forum post, every share, another heartbeat in its eternal life. Engines are metal, but their stories, they're human. And the Cleveland is full of them. A father teaching his son how to set valve lash on a 351C in a cold Ohio garage. A retired Australian racer wiping tears as he fires his Falcon GT one last time before selling it. A Brazilian taxi driver who bought a used Ford Landau in 1986 and still drives it daily, swearing by the reliability of his Cleveland. These aren't numbers, these aren't specs, these are lives. The Cleveland didn't just move cars, it moved people. It carried families to school, lovers on road trips, racers to trophies. It gave backyard builders an identity. It gave rebels a weapon. Ask anyone who's ever owned one. What did the Cleveland mean to you? The answers are never about horsepower. They're about pride, about belonging, about carrying a piece of forbidden history under your hood. That's why the legend matters. Because it's not just an engine story, it's a human story. So here we are, 50 years after its birth, decades after its death. And yet, the Cleveland still roars. You can feel it at car shows when a Mustang owner lifts his hood and the crowd leans in. You can hear it in Australia when a Falcon GT tears down Conrod Strait and echoes off the mountains. You can see it online in the millions of views and comments from kids discovering this outlaw for the first time. The Cleveland was never supposed to exist. It was born from rebellion, killed by fear, and resurrected by passion. It is the engine that proved greatness can come from defiance. That legends are written not by corporations but by the people who refuse to forget. And maybe that's why it hurts Ford's history so much, because their greatest engine was the one they tried to erase. And yet here we are, still telling its story, still hearing it scream, still chasing its myth. The Cleveland is not gone. The Cleveland is not forgotten. The Cleveland is immortal. This is Apex from Mythic Car Stories. Thank you for watching. Like, subscribe, and join the adventure.